Kim, what's on your radar today?
Well, while all eyes are on Ukraine, Palestinians have once again been under attack by Israeli forces. Tensions have escalated between the two groups during this holy month, Muslims celebrating Ramadan and Jews celebrating Passover. Both groups fight over holy sites that are important to both Abrahamic religions, particularly a site that is known as Al-Aqsa Mosque by the Muslims and Temple Mount by the Jews. On Friday, April 15th, Israeli soldiers stormed the mosque, injuring over 160 Palestinians and arresting more than 400. Video began circulating online of Israeli soldiers indiscriminately attacking unarmed women, the elderly, and disabled. There have been other incursions in cities inside the West Bank that have led to the deaths of over a dozen Palestinians. The deaths include a 14-year-old boy, a 17-year-old boy, a 34-year-old lawyer, and a half-blind widow with 6 children. The woman was thought to have a knife. She didn't. One of the boys threw a Molotov cocktail, and the lawyer had at one point participated in clashes. In response to the attacks, Hamas fired rockets from Gaza into Israel that were intercepted by the Iron Dome defense system and didn't cause any real damage. Yet in response, the Israelis conducted airstrikes on Gaza, hitting what they say was a Hamas weapons depot. Now, it would be unfair to act like the Palestinians are completely blameless. There have been mass shootings and stabbings conducted over the past few weeks that have left numerous Israelis dead. But here's Mehdi Hassan explaining why this conflict isn't really a both sides issue.
Now it's time to hand over to my friend Ayman Mohyeldin. But before I do, Ayman, a topic that you and I have covered for years is back in the headlines, especially since Friday. Israel's occupation of East Jerusalem, the West Bank and Gaza, and the violence we're now seeing in and around one of Islam's holiest sites, the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem. More than 170 people injured, more than 20 Palestinians killed. What bothers me, Ayman, is that some of the headlines in the news really don't do justice to the nature of that violence on the ground. It's always about clashes. In my view, a bit of a lazy journalistic term because it doesn't identify who or what is driving the violence. Clashes implies two equal sides with equal powers, doesn't it? Two equally responsible parties for the violence. And yet the missing context here always matters. One side is the occupier, the other side is occupied. One side right now in Jerusalem is throwing stones, yes. The other side is firing stun grenades and rubber bullets, including reportedly into people's eyes. And look, I get it. The Israelis have their security concerns. You have more than a dozen people in Israel killed, many others wounded over the past few weeks in horrific shootings and stabbings. And we all, of course, condemn those attacks on innocent civilians. But, Ayman, that doesn't justify, though, the scenes we're seeing in Jerusalem right now. It doesn't justify an Israeli operation inside one of Islam's holiest sites during this month of Ramadan. I'm pretty sure people would be up in arms if the American government, say, was violently raiding a major church during Easter, would they not?
Palestinians feel their land and homes are being taken from them, and what they're doing by throwing rocks and Molotov cocktails is defending their existence. They're vastly underpowered compared to the Israelis. Every time they've fought back, they have lost more land and lost more of their rights. So I want to point out some obvious hypocrisy. Where are the Palestinian flags and the hashtags like I stand with Palestine? Right now on social media, it seems like half of everyone has changed their profile to include a Ukrainian flag. People can talk freely about the atrocities happening against the Ukrainians and even champion them making homemade weapons to defend themselves. Yet these same people turn around and condemn Palestinians when they do the same. Here's a great example. This is Aviva Klampas, who was the head of speech writing for the Israeli mission to the UN. Here she is posting a photo of young Palestinians holding rocks, mocking people, calling them worshippers. Yet when it comes to Ukrainians making Molotov cocktails, she's praising them. She even has homage to Zelensky pinned to the top of her page. Now, Bella Hadid, a supermodel who is Palestinian, has her social media account regularly suspended for showing the atrocities being committed against Palestinians. And as Mehdi Hassan has pointed out, the atrocities committed against Palestinians gets labeled as clashes, whereas the war in Ukraine is often labeled as a genocide. In fact, we've even watched White House reporters badger the Biden administration to escalate the war on behalf of the Ukrainians. We must save them from their nuclear-armed, more powerful neighbor engaging in this unlawful land grab and massacre, they shout. Well, the same thing's happening essentially to the Palestinians. Even Tony Blinken, someone who's been actively refusing to support peace talks between Ukraine and Russia, is in fact calling for peace between Israel and Palestine. During phone calls with both the Israelis and Palestinians, Blinken stressed the importance of Israeli and Palestinian working to end the cycle of violence in Israel, the West Bank, and Gaza by exercising restraint and refraining from actions that escalate tensions. Meanwhile, the U.S. is expected to announce in the coming days another round of hundreds of millions of dollars worth of weapons being sent to Ukraine. So it's very hypocritical. That's the big thing that I want to point out. I want to also mention that though these tensions are horrific right now that are going on between the Israelis and the Palestinians, and the abuses on the Palestinians are very atrocious. Luckily, they're not as bad as they were last year when we all were horrified by the attacks on Gaza last May. They're not expected to escalate to that point, largely because of the new government. Netanyahu was much more of a hardliner, much more about punishing the Palestinians, showing them who's boss. The current government, Naftali Bennett, is not as, he's way more interested in keeping peace and minimizing destruction and death, largely because the coalition that they have right now in the government is very fragile. So we're not likely to see, serious escalations like we saw last year in Gaza, for example, many more of those airstrikes. But it is really horrific. The people are very much, there's a lot of aggression there. I've witnessed it myself. I was at Al-Aqsa Mosque in late 2019, and I saw a giant parade of Israelis coming in just to march around secured by Israeli military with their weapons fully there on the mosque territory, just marching around to just kind of exert, saying, we belong, this is ours, and we belong this. And of course, they have the right to protest. But when it escalates to the level that it has, and then the Israeli military comes in, the Palestinians are largely unarmed. Yes, they can. Some people do get their hands on weapons here or there, but by and large, they're mostly unarmed. And the Israelis are a much more powerful force. And so it is so similar in a lot of ways to what is going on. Well, it's similar, with caveat, to what the West is interpreting the Russia-Ukraine situation to be. Interestingly, the Palestinians actually side more with Russia on this, and the Israelis side more with Ukraine on this. There's a reason for that. The Palestinians sort of view the Russians as not an aggressive occupier coming into Ukraine, but instead a liberator coming in to help the oppressed people in Ukraine, in the Donbass region, the Russian-speaking Ukrainians. They view them similarly to themselves and see that they've been encroached upon, human rights abuses, and that Russia's finally coming in to save them. Palestinians have been begging for someone to do the same for them, and no one really does. Jordan sort of helped a bit. Some of the Arab coalition sort of did a bit. But by and large, they don't have a big Russia to swoop in. And instead, the U.S. has done a similar thing, which is arm the Israelis, arm the Ukrainians. So it's an interesting dynamic there. But the hypocrisy of the entire thing is...
Yeah, the double standard is notable. I remember people pointing out the fact that Twitter has these standards against, inciting violence against particular people that it completely threw out the window when it came to saying you want to have Russian heads on a pike, right?
Yeah,
and I think
right.
the example of Bella Hadid's accounts getting taken down repeatedly, it's so instructive. And, this is what, so many people are saying when they say, okay, why the left is so intolerant of the idea of the censorship on Twitter and Trump being pulled, because they see repeatedly that the imbalances swing, most pointedly against the left when it comes to advocacy for Palestine in particular. We talk about all of these censorship campaigns going on at colleges and universities, but often the unsung targets of so many of those campaigns are professors that speak out on behalf of the rights of Palestinians, like Cornel West, who very famously went through that whole tenure rigmarole at Harvard, in large part, he says, because of his advocacy for Palestinian rights. And I think that your point about the flag rings really, really true. From the earliest days of this conflict, it became clear that the flag was less about, and obviously individuals are where they are, and I think that people have a lot of really organic and sincere sympathetic sympathy for the people of Ukraine, as they should, but it has been politicized from the get-go, and you can see that in the differentiation between people's willingness to buy this kind of flag versus versus other kinds of flags. And since Russia became this kind of political pariah in the context of our own democracy in 2016, when it was really blamed for Trump's victory and Hillary Clinton's loss, since that point, being antagonistic to Russia has been a lot more than just about Russia, but talking about being a good liberal and anti-Trump and all of these other things.
Right.
And so now when this conflict broke up, it was perhaps only natural to see Ukrainian sympathies being used as a kind of proxy for being a good liberal.
Right. Yeah. And it's so interesting also that, for kind of to bring up some more of your examples, like when you mentioned Cornel West, we've seen people like Abby Martin, for example, being told that she's not allowed to speak, about Palestinian, about what's going on with the Palestinians and their rights and whatnot, not allowed to because of BDS. If you support BDS, which is boycott, divest, and sanction against Israel. If you support any of those things, then you're not allowed to hold certain jobs, to speak. Basically, you're not allowed to collect certain money from certain governments, state governments throughout the country. And it's so interesting because I wonder if we're headed in that sort of similar direction when it comes to Russia, right? Like you're not allowed to support Russia in any way or to say certain things. I mean, we even have bills that they're trying to pass, even here in the state of California, not necessarily about Ukraine and Russia, but certainly speech bills about, for example, the virus and vaccines and masking and whatnot, saying if you say certain things, then it is illegal in the state. And so we've seen examples of this with BDS. I'm curious if we're going to reach that point. It feels that way on social media a little bit, like even if it's not illegal, if you say something, you get eviscerated or you get labeled immediately a Putin puppet. So but the Palestinians are still very much fighting to maintain what land they have left. Every time they battle it out with the Israelis in an actual war, they lose more land, they lose more rights. They are trying to resist in other ways. Violence is never the answer. I do think that is worse for them. Every time there are acts of violence, it does make the situation worse. But this is just, the hypocrisy of this whole situation is mind-boggling. I think that's what I wanted to bring attention to today. So thanks for letting me do that.
No, it was really great and helpful, and I think will land a lot of people, resonate with a lot of people, because who among us hasn't been called a Putin puppet at this point?
At this point, right. Well, all right. All right. Well, thank you. We'll have more Rising coming up next.